Cyberpunk 2077 is the most important video game in years. Few titles have reached the astronomical levels of hype, and yet few titles have left so many people so disappointed. In this video, I want to look at the various controversies surrounding Cyberpunk's development, launch, the game itself, and what the industry and consumers can learn as a result. Let's imagine the date. It's the 9th of December and we're a day away from release day. Most games generate discussion surrounding their game on release day and the days that follow. But before we had even launched, Cyberpunk had already kicked up many interesting talking points. The first of these was the wait, 8 years to be precise, since the game was announced. Whilst this results in more development time, it also increases expectations. And admittedly, some people's assumptions for the game were too high. Having said that, CD Projekt Red did not do themselves any favours. Welcome to the next generation of open world adventure. You can't say something like that unless you are confident, super confident, that your game is at least amazing. Of course, this 8-year wait wasn't supposed to be 8 years, and yet the number one complaint is that the game still feels unfinished. Which you might think is quite frankly absurd. I mean, what were the developers doing? Well, unfortunately, they were working their asses off to a point that is unhealthy and wrong. This came after CD Projekt Red boss Adam Badowski stated that the company would not engage in any sort of crunch before release. The developers had no say in the matter, crunching since May 2019, with some developers working on weekends and pulling 16-hour shifts. As well as that, any time the game was delayed, they found out via Twitter, highlighting the huge disconnect between the developers and the managers who supervise them. I'll touch on these guys later, but no one should be working under these conditions, and it was terrible to see CD Projekt Red fall back on their previous statement. On August 20th, 2018, Cyberpunk tweeted this in response to another tweet. They later apologised for it, but unfortunately there is another controversy surrounding gender. Some insinuated that the caption "mix it up" was referencing how this person is transgender. I don't really want to get into this discussion, but it is something worth noting and thinking about for yourself. Next we have the issue regarding microtransactions, which were originally stated to not be present in the game. And whilst that is the case today, if Cyberpunk eventually gets multiplayer, it will contain microtransactions, contrary to previous quotes from the studio. Then we have the quite frankly abhorrent policy regarding reviews. Firstly, not a single console code was sent out to any reviewer, and secondly, CD Projekt Red prohibited reviewers from showing their own footage until they deemed it acceptable. This has helped inflate the average score from reviewers and mislead consumers, especially those on console, about the game's quality. No matter how good a game is or isn't, what CD Projekt Red did with regards to reviews is completely unacceptable. Cyberpunk features brain dances, a feature where you can revisit a scene from the past and view it from different angles. However, these brain dances were actually affecting those with epilepsy, and thankfully this was soon fixed. Though it begs the question of how something so unsafe was there in the first place. Finally, I want to talk about the expectation of Cyberpunk and the many promises surrounding it. CD Projekt Red made numerous false promises throughout development, some of which include the game would be completely fine on the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, the game's wanted system allows the player to bribe the police, NPCs would have daily routines, meaningful day and night cycles, challenging weather systems, apartment customization, wall running, etc. And this doesn't include some promises that were made but then later rescinded, including purchasing properties, a transportation system, and voice customization. It is absolutely understandable that the game has fallen below people's expectations if some of these promises were not upheld. Having said that, the content that is present doesn't exactly inspire. Okay, so it's the next day, release day, and the 8 million people who pre-ordered have descended upon the world of Cyberpunk. Quite frankly, there is a lot to say, so let's start with the positives. Night City is absolutely sublime. I'm not talking about the interaction with the world or the people, things to do, etc. I'm simply talking about the detail of the world itself. It's unique, bold, stunning, and every positive adjective in between. Night City isn't the biggest metropolis, but never has a game world made me feel so small, so insignificant. The skyscrapers tower above you, advertisements bombard you with capitalism, and the tight city streets bristle with noise and chaos. It's a joy to explore this world on the surface level. This is helped by the game's gorgeous graphics and lighting when it works. Of course, Night City is set in the year 2077, and the overall setting for Cyberpunk and the themes that go with it are handled really well. Overpopulation, the normalization of massive corporations controlling many aspects of our lives, the divide between the filthy rich and the struggling poor, and the illicit activity that stains the streets of the city. Cyberpunk nails the notion of immersing you in the world, again, however, only on a surface level. The characters you meet, the relationships to be had, and the stories that intertwine between them are all fantastic. This is one of the most crucial aspects of an open world to succeed in, and Cyberpunk has characters to remember. This goes hand in hand with the writing and story, which is decent but nothing special. There are many branching narratives and characters to keep track of, and the many choices relating to these will certainly entertain for many playthroughs. There are some excellent missions too, one in particular stands out to me.
貴様の母親が生きていなくてよかった。息子の不甲斐ない姿を目の当たりにして心を痛めずに済んだのだからな。これで誰のことも許す必要はない。
And with a heavy heart, I must move on to the negatives. Okay, so let's get started. You've probably heard this game is fucking buggy, like hilariously buggy. I'm playing this on the new Xbox Series X, and I experienced multiple freezes whilst free roaming, and a whole host of visual, animation, and gameplay bugs. And if you're playing this on the older generation of consoles, it's basically 720p resolution and 15 frames per second. And of course, bugs suck and they're annoying, but they're even more frustrating with regards to Cyberpunk, because it's masking the discussion surrounding this game and how most of it is fairly mediocre. Firstly, you'll customize your character and the options here are limited enough. Yes, you can change your penis and that's great, but how come if I load into any FIFA game, their face customization is far more detailed and precise. In my opinion, however, the character customization matters less, because you don't really get to define who V is. V is their own character, and you'll simply make quite small narrative choices to slightly change their personality. What makes this even worse is once you customize your character at the start, that's it. There's no barber or plastic surgery to visit to change your appearance. You will look like that until the end of the game, which is just inconceivable in a game like this. So what is the point in putting so much emphasis on style and character customization if your character cannot be properly defined, and once you do decide on your character, then you can't change it? I think it would have been better to either give us far more choices to define V's personality, or give us a character to play as. What tops this all off is the clothing system. For some god-awful reason, clothing has armor stats, so naturally you will wear your best clothes for combat, defeating any reason to stylize your character. In my playthrough, I chose the Corpo life path, And yes, these life paths decide where you start and your background, but they're quickly forgotten about after a couple of hours, only brought up occasionally as options in dialogue. It honestly felt quite rushed, like I was playing a sequel to a game I hadn't experienced. Speaking of rushed, there is a 6-month period at the start of the game that is scaled down to a cutscene. This is clearly just cut content, and who knows what we missed out on. Cyberpunk 2077 is an RPG, or at least that's what it used to say it was before it was converted to being an action-adventure game. The RPG elements of the game are severely lacking, however. You have basic skills that you can designate points to, and train to unlock perks for those skills. However, these perks rarely feel like they ever impact the gameplay in unique and interesting ways. They're mostly just percentage increases for headshots or reloading time. The skills intertwine with the gameplay, but you'll have little incentive to focus your points onto anything other than combat, because of how flawed the detection system is for stealth. As with many games, for some reason if one enemy spots you, the rest of the area goes into DEFCON 1 and rushes towards your position. Not to mention how sometimes it feels like enemies spot you when they shouldn't. You'll eventually start shooting things at some point, and you'll firstly need to adjust some settings here before it feels normal. Once you do, the shooting is okay, nothing to shout about, and certainly not helped by the fact that the enemies are bullet sponges. There's also a severe lack of enemy variety. Some will run at you with swords and some won't. Maybe you'll get hacked and that's about it. After killing everything, you'll start looting, and for some reason V can carry like 12 different weapons, but only use 2 and a melee weapon at a time. Anyway, it's time to drive to the next mission. In my GTA 6 video, I mentioned how the driving physics need to be improved from GTA 5. Well, recently I hopped onto GTA 5 after experiencing Cyberpunk's driving physics, and the difference in quality is absurd. Vehicles in Cyberpunk are not fun to drive. They somehow manage to feel light and heavy at the same time, understeering and oversteering with no sense of speed or control. There's also no option to shoot while driving. Okay, it's not GTA, but look at this scene from one of their promotional trailers, and tell me this doesn't suggest we can shoot whilst driving. The motorbike physics aren't great either. You can't even do a wheelie, and there's no option to move your body forwards or backwards on the bike. And if you thought driving couldn't get any worse, prepare to miss every low speed turn, because the minimap is zoomed into a point that when a turn arrives, you've already passed it. Driving goes hand in hand with the police, right? So how are the police in the game? Are there any chases, perhaps roadblocks, maybe even SWAT teams to hunt you down? No. The police or wanted system in Cyberpunk is perhaps the worst system of that description I've ever seen. So let's say you've just committed a crime. In most games, the police will arrive on the scene either by foot or by vehicle and try to arrest you. Not in Cyberpunk. No, in Cyberpunk the police will spawn. Yes, let me say that again. Spawn beside you and begin shooting you. As horrendous as that sounds, if you hop into a vehicle, congratulations, you've escaped. Because this game has no AI for driving. And the lack of AI for driving doesn't just include the police. It's the case across the board. The AI cars follow patterns around the street that if you disrupt, they sit hopelessly in their cars, waiting for the situation to be resolved. They don't drive around you or reverse, maybe get aggressive and just plow right through you. No, they just sit there and do nothing. Going back to the police, this means there are no police chases in a city that is tormented by crime. After hours and hours of playtime, I still cannot comprehend this. Cyberpunk's main missions certainly hit the mark with regards to enjoyment, so how do the side missions compare? They're fine. That's the best word to describe them. Most of them entail either sneaking, or at least trying to sneak into an area, and stealing an item. I complained about Watchdog Legion's missions in my review, but to be honest, they aren't that worse than Cyberpunk. Having said that, there are some noticeable exceptions. One mission in particular involved a man and a tortoise that was really quite memorable. To be honest, the side missions you'll enjoy the most won't feel like side missions, because they involve main storyline characters. They're held up by the decent writing, however, not by the gameplay. I mentioned how amazing Night City was, but crucially, only on a surface level. Interacting with this world is honestly quite frustrating and disconnecting. I came out of my apartment once to find two police officers chatting, but their chat was more of a lecture from one to the other. It felt like a serious discussion, and one that I could get involved in that may result in some sort of mission. However, there was no such option. I stood there aimlessly as they finished their conversation, and the next day I walked by and they were having the exact same conversation. To me, it summed up the world of Cyberpunk. Excellent to look at, but once you dig deeper, it's actually quite shallow. I'm writing this script on the 19th of December, 9 days after release, and Cyberpunk is still the game everyone is talking about for all the wrong reasons. So after the horrific launch of the game on the older generations, CD Projekt Red issued an apology and stated that those unhappy with the game should request a refund. However, they did not contact Sony or Microsoft about this, and suddenly those companies were inundated with refund requests. Sony were clearly quite pissed off, and decided to straight up remove the game from the PlayStation Store. Microsoft also expanded their refund policy to accept all refunds for the game. The whole situation is unprecedented. At CD Projekt Red, things weren't any better. An emergency board meeting was held to discuss the state of the game. I'll post a link of it in the description. A few days later, developers were asking questions during an internal Q&A about the game. Many angry that they had poured so many hours into a game that had effectively flopped at launch. One developer asked, how could they make a game about exploitative corporations while forcing devs to crunch? The response wasn't satisfactory. CD Projekt Red shares have dropped massively in the last few days, and the promises of future DLC and even multiplayer are now in doubt. It has been without a doubt one of the worst launches in video game history, and considering the hype, one of the biggest flops too. It may seem harsh because overall, this isn't strictly speaking a bad game, it's just nowhere near anyone's expectations. The whole situation for CD Projekt Red, for the reviewers and for the players, has been one to reflect on. How can a worldwide trusted company wait 8 years before producing a fresh original title and get it all so wrong? It begs the question of, well, if we can't trust CD Projekt Red, who can we trust? Yeah, okay, but seriously, I believe that so much good can come from Cyberpunk's horrendous release. Firstly, it means that many people will have doubts about other companies. This sounds like a negative, but ultimately it means less pre-orders and consumers being more aware of the product they are considering to purchase. Cyberpunk nailed the marketing. They had everyone sold that this game was going to be sensational. Yet the game was anything but that, and I hope this means more players won't fall into the trap of being consumed by the hype. We've all been guilty of it, but until you play the game for yourself, you won't truly know. Secondly, Cyberpunk has proved that gamers don't accept buggy or incomplete games. Game development is tough, it's long hours and painstaking work, and these days games are taking longer to produce. However, I think Cyberpunk's release will be a wake-up call to those companies considering pushing their game out to snatch some quick sales. It can backfire, and for CD Projekt Red, it blew up in their face. The devs themselves said we needed more time, the deadlines were unrealistic, and lo and behold the game was released regardless. That's not acceptable, and as a Halo fan it comforts me that bit more that Infinite has been delayed until next year. The wait sucks, but it increases the chances that it'll be worth it. Finally, I think Cyberpunk raises questions about reviews. As of writing the script, the game has a score of 87 on Metacritic, and this is purely an illusion. When reviews were released prior to the game's launch, many were angry that some reviewers, for example Callie Plagg from GameSpot, gave the game only a 7 out of 10. She ended up being right, but it begs the question of why she was in the minority. The game has countless 10 out of 10 or perfect score reviews, and I understand the area is subjective, but there is also an element of objectivity that cannot be ignored. Some of Cyberpunk's faults can't be dismissed, and I'm pondering whether or not there is a correlation between expectation and a reviewer's score. Why are people so scared to criticize a game that is perceived to be amazing, but so eager to criticize once it's mainstream? I understand the console fiasco affected the review scores, but a lot of these reviews are really misinforming for consumers. 2020 has been a crazy year, and I don't think many people thought we'd be where we are with regards to Cyberpunk. In years to come, people will look back at this launch as being significant for the industry. Buggy, unfinished, and subpar games are simply not acceptable, no matter how hyped they are. Consumers are tired of this shit, and it really is sad that out of all the games to fall into this category, Cyberpunk was next to do so. As for CD Projekt Red, it will take months, perhaps years of updates and fixes to rectify not only Cyberpunk, but also their reputation. But there are positives to take from this mess, and let's just hope the industry can see them.